Hi everyone, I'm Ali, I'm an architect, and today we're going to look at a Part 3 past paper, so let's go. Okay guys, so today is finally the day we're looking at a Part 3 past paper. I'm kind of cheating because the first one we're going to look at is my AA paper that I sat in 2018 when I passed my Part 3 exam, the second time that I did it. We're going to look at 4 questions from it, 2 in this video and 2 in the next video, and then in future hopefully we're going to look at some other past papers as well, so from like APEAS in Scotland and from the RIBA Northwest and other schools in London like Westminster. Okay, so in this series, these first 2 videos, and then future videos looking at Part 3 past papers too, I'm not going to give you yes or no answers on what is correct or not correct because it depends quite heavily on the scenario that you've been given in the exam and to what you should be considering. So when that's relevant in these questions, I'm going to highlight to you what the scenario was. But really, excuse that motorbike, really the purpose of these videos is more to tell you how to read through a scenario or a question, because a lot of the time clues to what the examiners are looking for you to answer is in them, and also it's a way of focusing your mind in the exam so you're not panicking and just listing a hell of a load of things, because just regurgitating information isn't enough. You need to have applied a kind of critical analysis to it and said this is what I think is important in this scenario, and not necessarily everything that ever was in like building regulations or planning or anything like that. That isn't really showing knowledge, it's showing awareness of a topic but not specific relevant knowledge. Okay, and also guys, you'll notice today that the setup has slightly changed, not to mention that we have the tea is here to kind of get me through this situation. Because there's been a lot of technical problems and so we're going through it. The mic is over here because we now have this camera here which is recording me handwriting kind of key responses to the questions. I thought that was better than typing, and then that's a bit of a pain in the arse. And then I've got a load of stuff to refer against as well. That's how I think we're going to approach it. If you have any comments about that, then please do drop them down below. If there's any particular past paper or questions you would like us to discuss on the channel, then again, drop them in the comments. And please do put a like on the video. That would be really, really helpful. It helps other people find it. And also, thanks everybody who's subscribed. I hope you're finding these videos useful. I think we are nearly at 50 subscribers, which I know is very small, but is also kind of crazy and cool. So thank you very much, guys, for watching. Okay, so scenario 3 is the one we're going to start with today. So this is the second question in the actual written exam. Scenario 1 is its own thing. You had a month on that. You were given that in your own time. You've come into the exam. This is the second question you're sitting under exam conditions. These questions are on the first 2 papers of the AA. So the way the AA works is that you have books and reference materials to answer these. So you're not just doing this blind. You can reference stuff. What I'm referencing is the answers I gave in 2018 and also just knowledge. But if you want to do them at home, then you should sit them under those same conditions. There is a link below to me having handwritten up this past paper. It's autumn 2018 from the Architectural Association in London. I cannot find them anywhere online anymore. I still have a copy of all their past papers previous to this one, but because this is the one I actually sat, this is easier for me as a first one to do. So if you want to follow along, that information is in the description below. Okay, so the way we're going to approach this, and I'm trying to keep myself on track so it isn't a complete rampage as usual, is that essentially I'm going to read through the scenario for you, and we're going to highlight the critical information in there, and if there's also anything for me to kind of fill in specifically, we're going to talk about that, i.e. in terms of the scenario and stuff and things that might have changed. Then we're going to look at the actual question itself. Sorry about that. So as I've said, the question is literally what they want you to answer. They're not asking you to answer the scenario. The scenario is just the kind of the climate in which this question's set. And then I'm going to tell you what they're looking for, essentially, or what this implies they're looking for from my experience, and also what I answered in 2018. So let's go. Okay, so scenario 3 is the proposed change of use has significant implication on the design of the building, which will need to be addressed. In addition, the building has been stripped back to reveal a reinforced concrete frame, which the client wishes to retain, essentially requiring the building to be reclad. Okay, so maybe for reference, let's draw ourselves a little sort of elevation-y diagram thing. Basically, as I said, the premise of this question and this whole scenario is that we have a client who has a kind of towery building of like 10 to 12 stories. It was previously all office, I believe. What they're planning to do is to split it up into uses like this, and they are also, rather disgustingly, but you know, this is what they're planning, is to clad each of these uses differently. So the blue is for residential uses, then they have like a bit of office use, and then the bottom floor is like active frontage, and they have like, you know, cafes and stuff in there, and that's the pink. And I get to use pens, so great. So basically, when it says change of use, which is our first thing that we want to highlight, so that's something important, what the client has asked to do is to remove the orange here, which is office, and what they want to do is pull the resi all the way down so that the resi sits here, and they basically remove the office, because what our client has said in this scenario is that that will be more financially viable for them. So that's the change of use they're referring to here. And then in addition to that, what else is there in this scenario that's relevant? So they've now done work on site and stripped back the building. It's a reinforced concrete frame to be retained, and it needs to be reclad. So for me, that's the key things in the scenario that we need to take into the actual question. So as I say, the scenario is giving you background information on what's happening. Obviously, if you have, or you go back and read scenario 2 and scenario 1, then you know the full information. I'm kind of paraphrasing it here for the video. So that's the situation we're dealing with. Let's have a quick tea break, guys, if this isn't scaldingly hot. So question 3 itself is, in light of recent events and current sensitivities around building cladding, what are the key building regulations that need to be revisited? Which other consultants will you require input from? And how would you seek approval for the relevant changes? So that's a 3-part question, okay? So basically they want to know key building regulations because of the change of use. They want to know other consultants, which we would require input from, and they want to know how would you seek approval for the relevant changes, so the change of use, which I believe I got wrong in the exam, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So basically the other thing to be aware of here is they're hinting quite heavily at what they want you to look at in this question. So it says, in light of recent events and current sensitivities around building cladding. Now, obviously, it's 2021 now when I'm recording this video, but that is still a major issue in the construction industry. A lot of regulations have changed because of it, and this is all really because of Grenfell, which is obviously a horrendous thing to have occurred, and we now live in the situation where a load of developers are refusing to reclad buildings and instead trying to charge tenants to do that, which personally I don't agree with, but that's a different video entirely. But basically what they're saying is that's the background for this question, and obviously in 2018 we were much closer then even to that disaster having happened. So it's really relevant in terms of the fact that we're recladding the building and retaining its frame, so we need to be aware of that and how does that impact things. So you can see here, this is essentially what I do or did in the exam, is what are the key things when you're trying to focus your mind on an answer to this question that you need to be considering. Really, if you kind of chill, don't panic, break it down. Question 3 is asking you 3 things. Key building regulations, that's not all building regulations, that's not all 17 sections of the building regulations, that's specific ones that you can talk about. Obviously, as I said, at this point you still have reference material, so you can literally just list them, which is not what they're looking for. They're looking for you to critically appraise which one is the key building regulations, or which ones are the key building regulations. Secondly, they want you to tell them which other consultants you'll require input from, and that's quite easy. You'll see in a minute how we're going to do that in terms of the building regulations we pick actually help us inform what consultants we might need to talk to. And then how would you seek approval for the relevant changes? So that's quite simple, that's planning process. What I told them in my exam, and I'm going to read it to you in a bit, is about the building regulation stuff, but that I don't think is what they were asking when I look at this retrospectively, although it didn't come up in my interview. But I think they're really asking you how you'd go about the change of use. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so this is the scenario and this is us having highlighted. Now we have to actually do the question, and obviously, as I said, we're under time pressure, so we need only some key building regulations. The question and the scenario have already given us 2 of those. I'm hoping that you are probably aware of what they are. So up here, reinforced concrete frame, we're retaining it, we're recladding it. That means we definitely are going to need to consider part A, which is structure of the building regulations. And handily, this also gives us a consultant, because we are also going to want a structural engineer to help us look at that. And it also gives us a potential second consultant here, which is a cladding engineer or a cladding specialist. We're going to put cladding specialist, which, having worked in the north for a long time, I was working on small buildings. That's a big building thing, but that's definitely a specialist that we would probably want to discuss this with. So what I wrote in my exam was literally part A, structure, and I put the new cladding will need to work alongside the existing structure, and the existing structure will need to be able to support the cladding, requiring a structural engineer. So a very basic description and who that then requires input from, but it's informed from the question and scenario. That's me just hitting the lights, ignore that. So that's been given to us basically by the question. Then we need another one. And as I've said already, very, very clear what that is, and the question is specifically asking you to mention this. So the next is part B, which is fire safety. If I can actually write. And so obviously relevant because it specifically asked us about recent events and current sensitivities around building cladding. We've spoken in structure about building cladding. Also then fire safety is going to be of massive importance for many reasons, but also because this is a tall building. So what I wrote was part B, fire safety. There are specific regulations for buildings over a certain height and the proportion of combustible materials. All areas of the building will need to be resistant to the spread of fire, requiring a fire consultant. And what I did do as well is put in a little bit of extra information because I was trying to be a nerd. So let me flip ahead in my notes to tell you about that. So I put that this would necessitate sample panels being tested to ensure that potentially different cladding can perform the same on the required build-up for acoustic and thermal performance. So basically, because we've got this building where they're wanting to clad by use, that's going to require different coloured cladding panels and potentially different backing systems for that cladding. And I'm no specialist in cladding, but that's basically just what you already know it's going to need. What that then requires is for these to be tested, not just independently, not just the cladding on top of its own fixings, but them next to each other, because if they're different, we need to make sure that there's no weak point in any kind of fire performance across the whole building. So basically I've said that. And the danger of only testing or providing details regarding one type of cladding is not extensive enough and not realistic of the performance of the final cladding of the building. So that was me trying to be a bit nerdy in saying that if we're going to clad these all differently as per the previous scenarios, then that's going to need to be tested holistically as a building rather than just the pink cladding on its own, the orange cladding on its own, or the blue cladding on its own. So that's another part of fire safety that I mentioned, and it's relevant also to some of the other building regulations potentially that we look at. So there's two there that I'm confident in, and there's two inputs from other consultants that I'm confident in. Then I was in the exam looking through the building regulations, as you would in this scenario, to see what else might be relevant. And I think there's two others. I have noted others, many others, in my own notes after the exam happened prior to my interview. But to be honest, because it said a few key building regulations, they're ones you want to be able to write a bit about and they're ones you want to be able to stand behind. It does not mean they want you to list every building regulation and how it's relevant. They know every building regulation is relevant because you're going to have to respond to them. So what they're asking you for is the key ones that this particular scenario, the change of use and everything, has impacted. So you have to try and think in that critical way. So the next one that I listed in my exam, and I think, I pretty much stand by this, is part E, which is resistance to the passage of sound, which I will write because I can't do two things at once. Resistance to the passage of sound. Now again, potentially, this presents us another consultant that we might want to talk to, which is an acoustic consultant. And the reason I listed this, well, I'll give you the reason I gave in my exam, which is this is relevant to all units, but particularly the residential units, and they need to achieve necessary acoustic separation, requiring an acoustic consultant. So that's the blue area. Now, because we know in this scenario that we're losing this orange zone and this resi is going to sit directly on top of our kind of more active uses, potentially that changes the acoustic situation of the building. I don't know, but I know we previously received full planning for this building. What might we need to look at? I think part E is a reasonable guess, was not brought up in my interview and therefore not a terrible choice. But like I say, I can't give you yes or no. I can only tell you that because of how I know this building's been laid out from previous scenarios, which ones of the building regulations jump out more to me to be relevant. If you're looking at other past papers, because of the scenario, there may well be very different ones that are more relevant. So I'm going to say that's a good one. So then the last one that I listed, because I kept myself to 4, I didn't go off on a crazy list, is the conservation of fuel and power. And the reason, well, I'll read you. the reason I chose this, I'll read you out, and then I'll tell you now, years on, why I would also pick it if they're not already listed. But basically, conservation of fuel and power. The building needs to achieve the necessary thermal requirements, and all units within it must achieve the required thermal efficiency for residential buildings. They will have been required to submit SAP calculations for planning and will need to achieve these outcomes. The reason I think that's more relevant than potentially other ones of the building regulations, again, is because of this different cladding situation we've got and different uses sitting together. So that's, for me, the main ones that I think we needed to list. And again, this gives us a potential consultant, which is an MAP consultant for the mechanical and electrical plant in the building. So that's a very basic quick brainstorm, and I know it isn't really quick because, hey, it's one of my videos, a quick brainstorm of what I said I should look at, and I kind of stand by it. I've listed other ones in my notes, like Part C, resistance to moisture, or Part M, access, or Part F, ventilation, stuff like that, but I don't think any of those, I don't describe them as key. So I still stand by those 4 as being the key ones. I mean, not necessarily even all of those 4. Really, the key ones are these 2, which are talked about in both the scenario and the questions. So they've already basically told you these are the ones we want to know about. And that's me just saying I know other ones that might also be relevant to this situation for various reasons. And so then what I wrote about in my exam question is I said the planner's support for cladding that expresses different internal uses, so this heinous combo, needs to be considered in regards to all the above, but particularly Part B, the potentially differing appearance of the cladding should not be made up of materials with different responses to fire, which leads into the bit that I read you before. Hear me turn the page, because I've said it would necessitate sample panels to be tested to make sure they all work together efficiently against fire, basically, to provide fire safety. Part B. Okay. So then the last bit of the question, so if we say we've done this, we've got key building regulations and we've also got other consultants. In this question, we're literally just listing them. It hasn't asked us to put it in the form of a letter or a memo or an email or anything. If they ask that, you should do that. We'll deal with that in other questions. But basically, it's just a list. So then how would you seek approval for the relevant changes? Now, as I told you, in the exam, I think I went on a bit of a rampage, and I've literally told them how you do building regulations approval. What I think they're asking, having looked back and reread all of the scenarios again, is the change of use itself, because in the previous scenario, the change of use hasn't actually been signed off. And then I'm thinking maybe in the exam I knew better than I knew now, but who knows? Basically, I'll read you what I wrote, and then I'll talk about what we could have spoken about for change of use, and that'll be the end of having a look at this question. But basically, I wrote the relevant changes would require approval from the local authority building regulations. We would submit a full plans application for their approval and work with them to achieve a compliant scheme. We could also use an improved inspector. The advantages of this for the project would be having someone who could work alongside the design team and contribute to changes as they happen, whereas the local authority requires all plans to be submitted and then provides feedback, which would take longer and potentially affect Fluid Space, that's my client's programme, if there were any changes required. So that's talking about a very general paragraph about building regulations approval, all legit building regulation approval, but I don't think that's what the question was asking. So if it's asking for the change of use here for planning, then I think the key thing is knowing what change of use was requested. Now at the time, what was proposed is this orange is office, so it's B1 class, and what they're proposing to change it to is to residential, which was a C3 class. Now, nowadays, talking to you from December 2021, B1 doesn't exist anymore. It's now EG, I believe. But I am a lady who does mostly master plans, unlike the other side of the world, so it's difficult to be, but EG is the one I would go with. I think it's the correct response to B1. It's the most office-based use class. So the interesting thing here is that quite a few years ago, prior to this exam, the government made it possible to change an office use to residential through permitted development. So were I doing this exam again, I might speak about that situation. And basically the issue of changing the use. I mean, in another exam, they might ask you to change it from a use within a use class to another use within the same use class, which doesn't usually require planning permission. You can always, as a safety thing, say obviously you would consult the local authority and ask them their own particular opinion upon this, but I do think it counts as a material amendment. You'd have residential sitting directly on top of another use. You're cutting out the office. The office space in Southwark was particularly relevant in scenario 1, which I've talked about, that was the month-long paper. They had a policy at the time that was that they would not lose office space. They did not support any loss of office space, hence why our client was re-providing it. In this scenario where they've now decided to remove it, that then could be a problem, but that's specific to Southwark Council and one of their policies. So it would completely depend on where you were doing it, and having done your research, that's the reason why you get paper 1 at the AA for a month, because they're asking you things like that. They want you to know the ins and outs of the planning regulations of that particular council, and also like the sills and things it's charging, because something that we spoke about was the fact that introducing residential units is going to push it over the threshold to need to require provision for affordable housing. It's also going to have to be charging sills and stuff, so that's going to impact for the developer. But that's all the change of use stuff. So essentially, that's a very quick overview of how I'd answer a question. What we're doing is reading, highlighting what's important. I've told you what my answer was. I've told you what they're looking for. You might well have a different answer, especially if you read the scenario differently or place different prominence on different things than you might. But that isn't necessarily what they're testing you for. Obviously, if it's a wrong answer, then it's a wrong answer. But they're trying to test how you think and how broadly you're thinking. What are you considering? And that's why I tried to do my nerdy thing of going, well, you know, obviously part B is important, but hang on a minute, I know we have this mental rainbow cladding, which is going to be specifically important in terms of part B. So that's having a look at paper 1. Oh, paper 1, scenario 3, which is paper 2, and we're going to have a quick look at one other question in this video, and then we're going to look at 2 more in another video, and that's us having looked at this particular past paper. So let's have a look at another question. Have a quick tea break, guys. Right, guys, I'm back with my whatever the hell my hair parting is doing, and we've got scenario 4 now. So this is from the same paper, same exam, as I said, link below for all of the scenarios in this exam. But this question I chose to focus on because quite helpfully it's one that you see in a lot of part 3 exams, and it's not relevant to the whole scenario thing that we were talking about. It's alluding to it, but essentially it's a standalone question. That's why we're going to have a look at it. So let's again read, highlight, and look at what we could potentially answer. So this is scenario 4. The purchaser of one of the flats in the Shoreditch project, which is a separate thing done by this architectural practice of imaginary times, designed by AA Architects, has completed recently. And they have approached you privately and asked you to design the fit out for his flat. He wants you to do this outside of your employment for AA Architects, as he hopes that as a private job, I hit the mic, but still, the fee will be cheaper. He also points out that as a member of the team, having designed the original project, you will have detailed knowledge of the project and access to the project documentation. So that's the scenario. That's what's happened. Some dude's come to us. He said, "Hi, you designed this flat for me. Would you also design the fit out of the flat, please? Because you know everything and you're amazing." Interesting. So question 4 is, before deciding or not to accept this as a private commission, prepare some notes to yourself on the risks and ethics involved if you were to accept it. So, okay, basically they're saying here that you're allowed to accept or not, like they want you to make your own decision here in the exam based on information in the scenario. Just some notes, so this is the thing, on the risks and ethics involved. So risks, ethics, this is the key 2 things that we need to be looking at in our response. Not like, you know, will the design be nice or not? Not relevant. We're looking at this as an architect from a part 3 perspective, so it's usually from a legal perspective, particularly, and the kind of they're going to sue you perspective. So risks and ethics is important here. Okay, so also what do we know of this? So this person is a previous client of ours. They're a purchaser of one of the flats. He said the fee will be cheaper. That's kind of the key thing here in the scenario. Is that true or no? We'll talk about that in a minute. And he also points out that as a member of the team designing the project, you will have detailed knowledge of the project and access, clearly, that's quite important, to project documentation. So that's the presumption he's coming to you with. Is that a relevant presumption or no? Okay, so the way I answered this question was with 7 bullet points, just on what I thought were the main risks and ethics of dealing with this dude and whether or not I wanted to, basically, because this is not necessarily asking you to decide or not to accept this private commission. It's asking you to prepare some notes on the risks and ethics involved if you were to have accepted it. So what are you going to need to be aware of? So essentially, I'm just going to list you what I listed at the time and see if I think anything is particularly missing. But these are all things that basically you should be aware of. They always ask a question similar to this, or I seem to have come across the fact that most practice papers and most actual Part 3 papers ask you questions like this because they're trying to test, are you aware of the limitations potentially of your employment contract? Are you aware of the risks of working as an architect, a trained, qualified architect, which I am in this scenario, for someone else outside of your contract with your actual company? Okay. That's just the sound of the GoPro dying. Right, we're fine again now. So yeah, basically what they're trying to do is find out if you're aware of the implications as an architect, because in this scenario, remember, you are a qualified architect. So what's the implications of you taking on work outside of your employment contract and your day-to-day job? That's what they're asking for. That's what we're going to answer. Okay, so the first thing is, where would you refer to for information on this? So obviously, your employment contract. So what I put is, this would be covered in my employment contract. We're just going to write employment contract for the sake of time, and then I'll read you what I put. Whether or not I'm allowed to undertake any other work independently. So a lot of big offices will prohibit you from undertaking work independently without their consent. That's quite normal, mainly because they want to make sure that you're not using their PI insurance, you're not using their software, and you're not opening yourself up to risks that then is somehow going to come back on them that they're not aware of. So for an example, I did a master plan competition myself whilst working at Allies & Morrison. It was a competition for the RIBA. There wasn't really any risk involved at all. It was just drawings and things as a proposition. And they were fine with that, but I asked them. So they don't allow me to undertake work without their consent. And some employment contracts won't list that, especially if it's in a smaller office. It won't necessarily say, but that is where you would go to first to check. And then obviously, if it didn't specifically say, speak to your employer. So the next one is literally that. I would need to discuss this project with AA Architects in order to be honest and discuss whether we should try to bring the project into the office or that I should undertake it alone. So basically what I mean there by saying honest is I'm referencing the ARB Code of Conduct. So basically the architects should be honest. So essentially you're not supposed to be misleading your employer and having doing work on the side that they're not aware of. So speak to your employer is essentially what I'm saying. And basically speaking to them about, do we have the ability to bring this into the office, or should I do it alone, and do you give me then permission to do it alone? Have a chat. Okay, then the third bullet point that I'd put was concern about the time and scope of working alone. It would be easier to undertake the project competently if it was run by AA Architects. So obviously, if you were, because we've said in this situation that we were to accept it, if you were to accept it, you work a full-time job in this scenario for AA Architects, which means if you were working on this project for this dude, you're doing that all entirely in your own time. Do you really have the time and resources to deliver that for him to the level that he actually probably expects? Or is it better that he actually does hire a real architect to do that, i.e. the company that has already built his flat for him? Then the next is, I would need to have independent insurance for the project if it is not run under the umbrella of AA Architects. So this is what I meant before. So this is professional indemnity insurance, PI, but also other things like liability insurance. So let's put on liability, because it's not just one kind of insurance that your office is covered by. They also have employer's liability and things like that, but that's if it's an office. But basically the insurance situation is massive in terms of risk, and you're a qualified architect in this situation. So again, RIBA Code of Conduct says that you need to have in place the relevant insurance in order to undertake work. So this one is kind of important and key, and I've snuck it in there at number 4 when I answered this question. But basically, if they're not going to have it under their umbrella of AA Architects, then you're going to have to do it on your own, which means you're going to have to pay for this on your own. And you don't exist on your own as far as the insurance companies are concerned. So it's likely to be a bit expensive as well. Would you take out insurance just for that one job? Or are you planning to start doing other jobs as well on the side? All these kind of things lead into the implication here that he thinks this is going to be cheaper because he's hiring you as a person rather than you as an office. And that is probably not true at all. But here we're kind of exploring it. So the next one is my fee should not be significantly lower, as arranging time to carry out the work independently would likely be more difficult, plus I will need to supply all my own resources and software, etc., so it would be more expensive than being associated with AA Architects. So this is what I said before. Basically, I'm trying in one bullet point to explain that I understand that it's very unlikely that AA Architects would allow me to use like their CAD, their SketchUp, etc. to do this work. And I could be in serious trouble if I was found to having done that without their consent. And I've got the insurance to pay for as well, and I've got to find time to do this after my full-time job. So I'm likely to be a lot more expensive than him using an actual architecture practice that I work out full-time during the day. So that's the next one. So then next again, to use the information from the Shoreditch project, what was the copyright situation with FluidSpace? What charge would AA Architects have for wanting to use this information? How relevant would it be? It should not be taken or used without express permission, as this would be unethical. So this is really important. Again, the reason you know from the question they want you to look at this, so you know they want you to look at, will the fee be cheaper? And they know you want to look at this, detailed knowledge and access to project documentation. The guy here is assuming that you can just use the plans for this building. The reason I've put questions in my answer is that I don't know. They haven't given me enough information. Does the architects I work for own the copyright, or more likely does the client who built the apartment buildings, do they own the copyright? In which case I couldn't use it without the express permission of both the client and the architects who drew it. So basically it seems crazy for him, well, it is crazy for him, he's not an architect, to assume that I would have access to that project documentation and could use it on my own time and on my own terms. That is probably not at all allowed. And if it is, they would probably charge me a fee to be able to use that. So again, leading into the thing of more expensive, very likely to be more expensive. And this is what this guy hasn't appreciated. So that's what this question's really trying to get at. And it's a risk, obviously, and it's an ethical thing as well, is to make sure that you have dealt with the copyright correctly. And that also matters if it's an architect taking over another person's job completely, or whether it's using previous information for a building. So copyright, essentially, is what that answer is about, and I've just sort of bulked it out in my response. So then the last one, because I think we're on, bullet point 7 that I put is it more ethical to approach it as a new commission and undertake a survey of the flat as it is and provide a service based on that information, so it can be completely ring-fenced from any work undertaken with AA Architects? So this was me trying to address the situation that's saying, were you to accept it, what's the risks and ethics? So essentially, because this copyright is likely to be difficult to get a hold of, difficult to use, and a bit dodgy, and potentially not even as built information, it might still just be construction information, it would be better for me and more accurate for me to go to that person's flat, give it a new survey, or hire a company to do a survey, and for me to use that information for any proposals rather than information from the construction phase of the project, which might not even be current. And also then ethically, you're not needing to do that whole situation. Obviously, ethically and risk-wise, there's still a whole load of problems here, but in terms of the copyright of the information, maybe a new survey. So again, I've written that in the exam answer as a question. I don't feel that I necessarily have enough information, and I probably don't want to take on this commission, honestly, so it doesn't really matter. But if I was to, I'd probably get a new survey, because it's then a standalone survey or piece of work, as if that building had been there like 200 or 300 years. We don't necessarily have accurate information for it. Start again from scratch and ring fence it from anything undertaken previously. And then what did I answer in the end? So I put, I would advise the purchaser that we would be able to provide a better service, as in AA Architects would, and dedicate required resources if he approaches AA Architects to undertake the commission. This then reduces a conflict of time spent on private work outside the office and allows the knowledge of the office for the Shoreditch job to be harnessed, legitimately harnessed. But the fee should not be significantly more expensive. So this is the point. He essentially, what I've concluded, and it doesn't necessarily ask me for a conclusion, but I feel one is relevant, is that for this particular client, it's not a great choice for him to go directly to me. It's better for him to stick with AA Architects. And to be honest, in terms of the expense, it should probably be more expensive for me to do it individually than it is for us to do it under the office, once you take into account all those issues that we've listed there. And then I've written a little bit of another note, which I didn't touch on in my exam question, but it is something that's always interesting and something that you could maybe discuss in the interview. You could write it if you felt. When I did my exam with APEAS, there was a question like this, and the potential client was a lot more of a red flag than this. But I would say, is this a bit of a red flag? Because I've put client with such a character wanting low fees, etc., is a bit of a red flag. I wouldn't necessarily want to do that kind of work. So the thing is, if they're coming to you specifically to kind of try and go around the legitimate system, is that a great client? Is that a client you want? I mean, we don't have enough information, we don't know them, we've never met them, but it's just a bit of a red flag to start with, and you want to understand why they're trying to not use the architects who designed the building to also do their fit out. Why would they want to go to somebody else? Specifically just because they're cheaper, but to also, I mean, not obviously it's not a problem in going to someone else, but they specifically want to go to someone else who has access, like a backdoor access to the project information. So that's a bit dodgy. So essentially, that's my answer to the question. I wouldn't want to do that piece of work for all of these problems. So yeah, exactly. That's what I looked at. This is scenario 4, question 4 of the AA's autumn 2018 exam. Essentially, again, quite a simple question. In the next video, I believe the question's a little bit more complicated in what they ask you to answer. All they've asked us to do is some notes. So obviously not just bullet points like this, but like I say, bullet points like I read to you that have more information of why that's an issue, is really what they're looking for. And particularly ones around risks and ethics. So you'll see that most of these are risks, or they all have inherent risk and ethics. And to be prepared to discuss that also in your interview. But you can see the crucial thing that hopefully you can see between these two questions that we've looked at today is how in the scenario or in the question, there's a hell of a lot of information about what they're looking for you to answer. Like, they're not just kind of trying to throw you in there and be like, so quickly, think of part 3. Because as you know, if you're doing part 3, the stuff you have to learn and be aware of is vast. And so it's really difficult to kind of tie it down. What the questions and scenarios here are trying to do is actually give you that information already. And as I say, you can also sometimes like go on in the exam, look at the next questions, see if they have an answer to the previous question. So it's like there's information there for you to use as long as you don't panic and you think about it. You break it down into simpler things. You go, right, what they want is they want some notes. They want notes on risks and ethics. They don't want notes on like everything ever under the sun. They just want that. What are the key ones? How many can I think of? Obviously, you're under exam conditions, you're under time pressure. They know this. In your interview, if you make a mistake, as I've said, you can literally always say, I'm really sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. That was wrong. I did that. I passed my part 3. It's not a problem because if you know it, that's the point. And they want you to kind of retrospectively look at your work and go, okay, well, having reread that, I was fully insane when I answered that question. But as we say, a lot of detail here in the questions of how to answer them. So that's all the colourful pens that we have time for today, guys. Hopefully this was useful in a quick look at some exam questions and how to answer them. I know I have not told you this is the answer. I've told you what I answered in 2018. And I haven't really thought that more in depth about them. I think these are still relatively good coverage of bases as answers, not necessarily amazing. I think obviously in the previous question, me just answering about building regulations instead of a change of use application was an issue, but they didn't ever bring it up and it showed a different kind of knowledge, so it's not actually necessarily a problem. I think it's more me misunderstanding the question at the time. But yeah, essentially what I'm trying to do is not give you the answers because I can't give you the answers. That's GoPro dying again. Thanks, GoPro. I'm not giving you the answers, I'm giving you how you should approach the question because hopefully this is more useful. I don't know what school of architecture or what provider you're doing your part 3 with. The questions and the way that stuff's organised can be very, very different across them. But what is usually consistent is that the question is kind of giving you a bit of the answer in it. And that if you calm down, underline some things, make yourself some notes, think about some stuff, what is it that they want you to look at, and then focus in specifically on that, especially in exam questions like this, where you still have access to reference material. By highlighting things that are specific, you can look and look up information that's specific to that question, not just sort of panic and start randomly reading all of the books that you brought with you. So that's not a great approach to part 3. So essentially break it down, think about what it is that they want to know, and then specifically tell them that. If it's in the form of an email or a letter or something like that, then you need to set it out in that way as well, which can take a bit of time. And you don't have to cover everything. Very usually you have access to this exam after you've sat it, before you sit your interview. And if you come in and say, yeah, I made a mistake on question 4, like I was crazy at that time, what I would have answered is this, that looks really good because you've gone back and reassessed what you answered. which I did not do the first time I did my part 3. Probably another reason why I failed it. You want to look back and be like, okay, yeah, I made a legitimate mistake there. I wouldn't have done that. I was under exam conditions. I don't know what I was thinking. But you just need to be calm and think about the logical responses and what they're trying to get out of you, what they're trying to ask you about, what do they want you to know as a potential architect. You're very, very close to becoming one if you're sitting your part 3 exam. So they want to make sure that you're considering everything and that you're being professional about it and that you're aware of the situation you exist under, specifically the ARB Code of Conduct. So that's kind of it, guys. That's our first look at a practice paper. As I said, the link to me handwriting up the AA's practice paper, this specific one, which was the autumn 2019 paper, is in the link below, including scenario 1, which I'm going to type up for you guys. So, you know, at least one person download it. I don't know. It's not a lot of work. It's fine. But basically, that's how they lay out their exams. Obviously, in future, as I say, we're going to have a look at some other exams from different places. They sometimes are slightly different. Different ones don't do so much of this scenario thing. Some places do. It's more traditional than it is, but we'll deal with that when we come to it. The next video, we'll look at another 2 questions from, I believe, paper 3 of this exam, where you get a little bit more in depth again on certain things, and hopefully, again, useful. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Great to see you all here again. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking. It really does mean a lot. It makes a difference. If you have anything you'd like to discuss or want me to have a look at, drop it in the comments below. And if not, have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.